Oh, hello there, and welcome to my little cabin. My name is Ben White, and I'll be your host here. I have a lot of things I would like to talk to you about now that you're here. But last year, a pretty bold claim got a lot of media attention. The claim was that 8 people now have the same amount of wealth as the poorest 50% of the world. The claim came from an organization called Oxfam. On their own website it says, Oxfam is an international confederation of 20 organizations working together with partners in local communities in more than 90 countries. So what is the mission, you may ask? On another part of the website it says, our purpose is to help create lasting solutions to the injustice of poverty. We are part of a global movement for change, empowering people to create a future that is secure, just, and free of poverty. Okay, so they basically want to create a safer world without poverty. Sounds like a pretty noble goal. But what else do they tell us, other than the pretty clickbait-like claim that 8 people now have the same amount of wealth as the poorest 50%? Well, if we look into the report where the claim originates, Oxfam also tells us that a CEO from one of the top 100 largest companies listed on London Stock Exchange earns as much in a year as 10,000 workers in Bangladesh. And in India, a CEO gets 416 times the salary of a typical employee. On the global scale, Oxfam's own research has also arrived to the conclusion that over the last 25 years, the top 1% has gained more income than the bottom 50%, and 46% of the global income growth went to the top 10%. So it is to be understood from the report that inequality of the world has gotten too much out of control. And these numbers does sound pretty insane, to me anyway. So I decided to look into what other sources say about the inequality of the world. And we begin with the Global Wealth Report 2016 from Credit Suisse. Already from the introduction we can read that the bottom half collectively own less than 1% of the total wealth, while the top 10% owns 89%. But that's just the introduction, and we shouldn't make any conclusions on the introduction. So let's take a further look into the report. Maybe we will see that the economy is in fact more balanced across the world. Now what we have here is the wealth pyramid. It's a pretty nice visual representation of the wealth distribution in the world. So what does it reveal? Well, the distribution of wealth definitely seems to hold up to what it said in the introduction. The top, that is, a little group of 0.7% of the world population has a grip on 45.6% of the wealth. And then we have the poorest group in the wealth pyramid. That covers 73.2% of the adult population. They are so fortunate that they get the last 2.4% of the wealth. Credit Suisse also tells us how the wealth is distributed among the different regions of the world. On this figure, we can see that USA and Europe has most of its adult population in the 2 top tiers of the wealth pyramid. The Asia Pacific is pretty evenly distributed on all 4 levels. The same goes for China, though most are still in the 2 lowest tiers. But the inequality gets really prominent in India, Africa, and Latin America. You know, if I take a magnifier glass, I will just be able to notice these 3 regions in the 2 first tiers. But the majority of the people from those regions are in the 2 lowest tiers. Another way to look at the distribution is by comparing the size of the adult population in a region with the amount of wealth the region controls. Because USA and Europe has most of its adult population in the 2 top tiers of the wealth pyramid, the 2 regions obviously also has most of the global wealth. But did you imagine that the difference would be this great? According to Credit Suisse, North America and Europe together account for 65% of total household wealth, but contains only 18% of the adult population. The wealth therefore goes far beyond the number of adults in USA and Europe. In Asia Pacific, the percentage of adults fits pretty closely to the percentage of the wealth. But in all other regions, it's basically the opposite. The wealth doesn't match their population. What does this inequality between the countries then mean for the bottom 50%? Africa and India certainly has the worst end of the bargain, since nearly 80% of the population lives in the bottom 50%. Not that it should come as a surprise, since it matches perfectly up with these regions having the least amount of the global wealth. The rest of the regions are a little more evenly matched by the amount of adults living at the bottom 50%, except for USA, where there is as good as no adults in the bottom 50%, but those that are there are living in negative wealth. Here, the USA matches pretty evenly with the rest of the world. Despite the very uneven share of wealth between the regions, they all have something close to the same percentage of adults in negative wealth within the region. China is sticking a little out though, with the least amount of people in negative wealth. And that is even though China has most of its adults in the lowest tiers of the wealth pyramid, and the percentage of the world's adults living in China is the double of the percentage share in the global wealth. The amount of people in Europe living in negative wealth is in the report from Credit Suisse explained by the high wealth countries in North Europe combined with the lower wealth countries in the East and South. For North America, the number of people living in negative wealth is to a certain extent due to poverty and how easy it is to borrow in the country. In this figure over the composition of debts, we can also see that in the USA there is a significant amount of the bottom 20% that gets there due to student loans, while most of the debts in Europe is because of mortgages. About the risk of getting poor, Credit Suisse writes, within countries, the major risk factor for households being wealth poor are having a head who is young, single, or poorly educated. In particular, it is not uncommon to find well-educated young people in the bottom wealth quintile. Although this is largely a consequence of young people being at the beginning of the life cycle of wealth accumulation, it also reflects poor job prospects in recent years and mounting student debts in some countries. So young people start an education in the hope of getting a good job. To make it, they need to take a student loan. And when they are done with their studies, their job options are poor, and then they can't pay their loan back. Well, that sounds promising for young people with hopes and dreams, ready to have them broken. I think I've seen enough in this report. It isn't really inspiring, I would say. What about another report? The World Inequality Report from the World Wealth and Income Database, which came out this year. Firstly, I want to look at the income of the top 10% around the world. How have they been doing for the last couple of decades? Here is a graph that tells us just that. Seems like it's just been going one way for the top 10% in most countries since 1980. Up, up, and up. Especially in Russia, there is a sudden rise in the income of the top 10%, which indicates the transition from a communist to a more open society. And then there are a few countries on this graph where the top 10% has just kept a steady high amount since 1990. It is a pretty big piece of the economic pie that goes to the top 10%, especially in the Middle East, where they take 61% of the income, together with Brazil, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where they take 55% and 54% of the income. Okay, so that was the top 10%. That makes me wonder. There's been a lot of talk about the top 1% in recent years. How much do they count in all of this? I might as well try to find out. Let me take a look here. Well, that is understandably something to talk about. The top 1% has apparently risen to take everything from a little over 10% to nearly 30% of the income, and still with Brazil, India and the Middle East at the top. I have a bad feeling that since the top 10% has had so much growth, that the graph for the bottom 50% won't look very promising. Yeah, that is what I suspected. A nice slide down for the bottom 50% in most of the countries, with a hard drop to Russia after 1990. And then of course we have the Middle East, where the bottom 50% has been reduced to only get about 10% of the income. So that is kind of depressing. But a kind of good thing is that the income for the top 1, 10 and bottom 50% has been pretty steady for Europe since 1980. According to the World Inequality Report, this is because Europe had a high success in somewhat containing rising inequality through policies favoring lower and middle incomes. So there's that at least. Okay, now let us take a step back again and look at how much income growth each percentile has gotten across the globe. Well, after all the data we have been looking up till this point, I guess that it is hardly surprising how this looks like. The top 1% got 27% of the growth since 1980, as much as the lowest 70% of the population. That, I think, will get most people to roll their eyes. But even more absurd, the top 0.1% in itself captured 13% of the growth, close to the same as the bottom 50%. What does this even look like? I think it's time that we take a more direct look at inequality within countries. Here we have an interesting paper which tells us what the pay ratio is between a CEO and an unskilled worker in 16 countries. That sounds pretty concrete. So let us play a little game here. What do you think that the ratio between a CEO and an unskilled worker is in the United States? Just, take a guess. Have you done that? Okay then, I can tell you that in the United States, the pay ratio between a CEO and an unskilled worker is 354 times to 1. Did you imagine that? I certainly didn't. This may be the greatest income ratio in a Western country, but research in 15 other Western countries has also shown a pretty big difference between the CEOs and the workers. Poland had the lowest ratio, that goes 28 times to 1. After USA, Switzerland had the greatest ratio with 148 times to 1. In this chart, we can see the actual ratio between the CEO and the worker compared to what people estimate it to be and people's ideal ratio. The gray color is the actual ratio, while, yes, the red color represents people's estimated ratio, and the blue represents their ideal ratio. So it seems like people in general have no idea about how great the inequality really is within their own countries. Something very interesting to note with this study though is when it comes to the ideal ratio, people pretty much agree across political and socioeconomic groups. As the author states in his conclusion, these results suggest that, in contrast to the belief that only the poor and members of the left-wing political parties desire greater income equality, people all over the world and from all walks of life would prefer smaller pay gaps between the rich and the poor. A similar study was made back in 2011 that only covered the United States. And when you look at this figure, you will quickly realize that the conclusion must be the same as in the other study. That is to say that people don't really know the amount of inequality, but there is something close to an agreement on the ideal distribution across politics, class, and gender. I guess it's kind of beautiful to realize that people might not be as far from each other as one would think from following the news. I mean, it would be beautiful if it wasn't for the tiny little fact that just because people can agree about the ideal distribution, it doesn't solve how the distribution should be made. I guess that's where the disagreement comes in. But with all this talk about inequality, there are those who argue that it isn't really the inequality in itself people are concerned about. That is put forward in a paper from 2017. In the paper, there's focus upon people's distribution choices in smaller and larger groups of people. And the researchers write, so, when people are asked to distribute resources among a small number of people in a lab study, they insist on an exactly equal distribution. But when people are asked to distribute resources among a large group of people in the actual world, they reject an equal distribution and prefer a certain extent of inequality. We can therefore say that if people themselves had the power to make the distributions in society, there would still be some inequality, just not the level of inequality we see in reality. In the paper, it is therefore argued that what people really are concerned about isn't inequality. Instead, the concern is of fairness. In another part of the paper, there is a comment to this. In our own time, there is controversy over whether fairness dictates that everyone should have equal access to healthcare and higher education. Put differently, there is some disagreement over what should be a right, held equally and unchanged by any sort of variation in merit. Basically, people agree that society should be fair. The problem is that nobody can agree what fair is. Well, isn't that a pickle? But from the graphs that show how people themselves would distribute the wealth, we can at least say that no one seems to think that the current system, where the top 20% has hold on 80% of the wealth, is fair. Now you may think, okay, so the world is very unequal, but what is wrong with that? Well, a Richard G. Wilkinson and a Kate E. Pickett has researched the consequences of inequality, and the data suggests that several social problems correlate with inequality. This includes things like increasing obesity, teenage births, and less social mobility. These may be individual concerns, but there are other problems that will affect society as a whole, such as homicides, trust issues, and racism. And that is just a few of the things we need to be concerned about if inequality gets too great. Of course, it should always be said that correlation doesn't equal causation, and the study has been questioned. But as stated by E. Wesley F. Peterson in a paper from 2017, where he has looked upon the paper by Wilkinson and Pickett and some of their criticizers. Even if it cannot be shown that economic inequality is the prime causal factor behind these problems, there is clearly a strong association, and it is likely that it is a contributing factor. Other scholars have investigated the link between inequality and particular sets of problems, and much of this work does support the idea that inequality contributes to social and environmental problems. With this being said, there are those who propose that neither inequality itself nor fairness is the right thing to focus on. Instead, the concern should be to lift everybody up on a reasonable living standard. What really matters, H.G. Frankfurt argues, is that everyone has a sufficient amount to live a decent life. Frankfurt acknowledges that a focus on improving the situation of the most needy may reduce inequality as a side effect, but argues that this reduction is not, in itself, a moral good. Okay, so it seems like Frankfurt believes that we should focus on taking people out of poverty. And when we looked at Oxfam's stated mission at the beginning of this video, we could also see that they want to get people out of poverty. So I guess we should look into the poverty of the world to get that perspective. Alright, let's do that then. Here, the website Our World in Data has a whole section about the subject. So what does it look like? This figure shows the number of people living in extreme poverty has been on a steady decline. We can see three definitions of extreme poverty. One of $2 a day, one of $1.9 a day, and one of $1 per day. Now this is a pretty low standard to set for a poverty line, which I guess is why it is called extreme poverty. But still, if we go with the $1.9, in 1980 there were still 44% of the world population living for less than that. In 2015, the estimation is that it has been reduced to fewer than 10% living like that. So here things seems to go in the right direction. Hallelujah for that! As written on the Our World in Data website. On every day in the last 25 years, there could have been a newspaper headline reading, "The number of people in extreme poverty fell by 137,000 since yesterday." We rarely get to hear that angle on the story. This is probably why people believe that the number of people living in poverty has increased. In the UK, there has been a survey that showed that 55% believe that there has been an increase in poverty over the last 30 years. Another report has showed that on the global scale, as many as 70% believe there has been an increase of people in poverty. Only 13% believe there has been a decrease. The optimism around decreasing poverty, though, is widely different from country to country, with as many as 50% in China, but only 8% in the USA believing that there are less people in poverty than 20 years ago. But if people have been escaping extreme poverty, what does that mean for people's life expectancy then? If we look on a graph from the World Bank, we can clearly see how the global life expectancy has increased from 52 years in 1960 to nearly 72 years in 2015. It therefore wouldn't be an overstatement to say that the world has seen a great lift in what can be expected of life over the years illustrated in the graph. On the website Our World in Data, it is put like this. Nathan Rothschild was surely the richest man in the world when he died in 1836. But the cause of his death was an infection, a condition that can now be treated with antibiotics sold for less than a couple of cents. Today, only the very poorest people in the world would die the way the richest man of the 19th century died. Well, isn't it nice to get that perspective? To get some estimation on how much better people's lives has gotten in general over the last 100 years. That is wonderful, isn't it? But enough of all this sweet optimism. A paper from 2016 gives us a sobering reality check and makes us remember that poverty is far from over. Firstly, it tells us that the line of extreme poverty at $1.9 means that if we just change the poverty line by 10 cents, we can add or subtract 100 million people to the global poverty count. They also state that even the optimistic narrative about the people escaping poverty and the emergence of a new middle class hides that most people are still living in conditions which are far below what the developed world consider middle class. So the researchers has illustrated how the reduction of poverty would look depending on where the line of extreme poverty is set. The highest they put the poverty line at is $10 per day. And here we can easily see how the reduction of people in poverty is significantly more moderate. especially if China is excluded. But, as stated later in the paper, this is not to dismiss the progress that has in fact happened in lowering the number of people in poverty. Rather, we are noting that the decline is of course welcome, but really rather modest. The real contention is of course whether anyone can live on $1.9, and if that does provide the capacity to purchase minimum food requirements. And on that happy note, I will end this episode of InfoSoup. I think it would be a pretty fair conclusion to say that Oxfam paints a pretty correct picture of the extreme inequality of the world. But all I have said in this video is of course just the surface of information about inequality and poverty. So I will put links in the description with all of the sources mentioned and more so you can go check yourself. Don't take my word for it, I'm just a rambling cartoon character made by some guy on the internet. Now let me ask you, dear audience, do you think the international poverty line makes any reasonable sense? And what do you consider to be the right distribution from the richest to the poorest in a country? And what about globally? Is the gap between rich and poor even important if the general living standard is rising and people escape poverty? Tell me in the comment section. And if you liked this video, or at least found it interesting in some way, please share it with people who may not know about the global inequality. Take care of each other, and I'll see you next time.